Welcome, everybody, to come back to the new episode of the Crosse Thinkers. Today, we have Ben Golden from the Theater Arts Department, and our topic will be one of the freshman seminars titled Our Stuff, Design, Sustainability, and Craftsmanship in the Age of Ikea. So let's start with the designing principles. What should we consider when designing an object? What is the process?
So we actually just talked about this in my class today, so this is really timely. There are a number of different things that we can consider when we're designing an object. The functionality of the object, right? What's its intended purpose, and how well does it suit that purpose? There's this idea of universal design, which is design that seeks to reach the broadest audience, right? So if we design an object, can we make it usable for the broadest audience? One of the things that really interests me is the sustainability of the design. Sometimes that's referred to as cradle-to-cradle design. When we design an object, are we thinking about not only what happens at the beginning of its life, so how do I design this object so that someone's going to want to buy it and then be able to use it, but then also how do I design an object so that when they're done using it, for whatever their intended purpose is, that it comes apart into its core pieces, right? So that it can be reused as something else. So that can be a component of design. Aesthetic considerations. Is this visually beautiful, right? Is it something that somebody is going to want to keep around? My dad was a carpenter, and he always used to say that beautiful houses last longer. Because if you have a house that's beautiful, especially in what we might consider a timeless way, right, then people are going to want to take care of it. And if people take care of it, it lasts longer. So there's also the aesthetic considerations of design as well.
Interesting. So can you elaborate more on this cradle-to-cradle design? And especially what happens after the useful life. Can you give us some examples on? Because I'm not familiar with the concept.
Yeah. So so cradle-to-cradle design comes from a book that came out 20 or 25 years ago by an industrial designer and an architect. And their idea was that that we should also, if we design a product, part of that design process should be to design what happens when we're done with the product. So if you think about a TV is a good example, right? So you buy a TV, what you're really buying is the service, right? You want to watch things on the TV. You're not thinking of it as, oh, I'm buying this amalgam of plastic and steel, and there's a little bit of lead in the solder and some cadmium and some silicon, and right? You don't think of it as its component parts. You think of it as, I'm buying this service. I buy this object. It allows me to watch Stranger Things, right? Or whatever. So the idea that as a part of the design process, you think about the end of that life, you almost think of that more as a service, right? So you're not just planning the beginning of the service, which is the sale and the use of it, but you're planning what happens at the end of it. So the two authors of the book, it's McDonough and Baumgart, and they what they've gone on to do is create an open source cradle-to-cradle certification. So if you have a product and you're designing that product, you can go to them or you can go to this open source certification, and you can get a certification that says my product has not only thought about how it gets sold, how it gets used, but also what happens at the end of its life. So a lot of the things are, can you take this product apart into its component parts? So the classic example of this is the paper juice boxes. Mm-hmm. So, if you get a Welch's apple juice box, the outside of it is plastic. The label is plastic. Inside of that, there's a layer of paper. Inside of that, on the inside of the carton, is a layer of aluminum foil. And then you take a plastic straw and you stick it through it, right? So that essentially cannot be uncomposed from those parts, right? You can't take the aluminum out and recycle it. You can't take the paper out and recycle that. You can, but it's quite a time-intensive process, right? So the idea of cradle-to-cradle design is when you're thinking about how am I going to, what am I going to put this juice in when I sell it, you're also thinking about, is that thing recyclable? Can it come back apart to its component parts? They use the book actually as an example. So the first line of the book of Cradle to Cradle is, "This book is not a tree." It's actually made out of a polyester that is highly recyclable. I guess this is where we get into materials design, and it's kind of outside of my wheelhouse, but it's a product that doesn't take a lot of energy to put back into it to recycle it. And so you feel it, and it feels a little bit like paper, but it's kind of got a smoother feel to it. But they did that on purpose to say this is something that is actually more easily recyclable, and a little bit counterintuitive for us because we think of plastic's bad, right?
Yeah.
Plastic's made out of petroleum. That's no good. But if in the end you end up with something that is more easily recycled and turned into the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, then there's some value in that too.
But even when you talk about design, when you talk about recycling, I'm more thinking about it from the material side. But is there any design that basically even me as a user, I can actually reuse? For example, I take something and then I use it for 2 months. After that, that's in breaks. But I use it for something else instead of just recycle, and somebody's going to make something out of it.
Right. Well, there's, I guess there would be, some of the classic examples of those reusable things are things that have been around for a long time. A glass bottle is a really good example, right? If we buy our apple juice in a glass bottle, I drank out of it, I drank all the apple juice, but then it becomes a reusable glass bottle and I can use and use and use, right?
Or you can keep the bottle just for sauces.
Right, exactly. Or there are people that have antique bottle collections, right? So there are a lot of uses, but it all has to do with in elementary school we all heard reduce, reuse, recycle. Those are the 3 R's, right? And what I didn't realize until I started to study some of this is that, first of all, reduce, reuse, recycle, it's not just 3 things. That's actually an order, right? Mm-hmm. The most effective thing in terms of sustainability is to reduce the amount that we use. The second most effective thing would be reuse, right? It takes a lot less energy for me to take that apple juice bottle and fill it up with hot sauce than it does to send it back to a factory where they melt down the glass and they reform it into another bottle, right? And then there are various versions of people who have added to this refuse and reconsider. So to refuse is a little bit like reduce, but instead of saying I'm going to use less of this, I'm going to say, do I need this thing at all, right? And then reconsider, right? Do I need this? Do I not need it?
Okay, interesting. So that is all actually in the designing process.
It can be, right? If you're thinking about it from the cradle to cradle approach, because the traditional design process is linear, right? Mm-hmm. You look for a need. There needs to be a better ironing board. Maybe the current ironing boards, they're too flimsy, they tip over. I want to design a better ironing board. So you find a need. You do some research into the best ways to fulfill that need, right? Which may include looking at other ironing boards, but it may include looking at, well, what are other kinds of tables, right? Or what are other kinds of surfaces that, use a lot of heat, right? Mm-hmm. That can stand a lot of heat. So you do some sort of research around that, and then you design a product that you think meets that need out of whatever materials you think best meets that need. You consider things like, is this accessible for all users? What if I had a disability of some kind? Could I still use this ironing board, as an example? And but fundamentally, it's sort of a linear process. You're trying to find the need, and then you find these materials, you build the product, you sell the product. Somebody buys the product, they're very satisfied with it, they use it for as long as it lasts, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 50 years, and then when they're done, best case scenario, they recycle the product into something else. Worst case scenario, they throw it away, right? Mm-hmm. And it ends up in a landfill. But if it ends up in a landfill, it's a linear process, right? We've extracted these materials out of the ground, we've turned them into something, we've used the thing, and then it gets tossed in a landfill, right? And then those materials are no longer useful to us. They're no longer usable to us. So if you're thinking about design from a cradle-to-cradle standpoint, you have to think about, how do I make that linear process circular? And there's a lot of people who have talked about and thought about and written about the idea of a linear process when our world is finite, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have finite resources. We can't run a linear process forever with finite resources. And so that was the idea of this book, of cradle-to-cradle design, is at some point we're going to have to figure out how to harvest these materials out of the things that we're done using. And wouldn't it be great if, when we were designing the product, we thought about that? So it's everything down to, if I design a computer, how easily is it repaired, and how easily do the components come apart? Do I have a plastic piece that is affixed to a metal piece with a screw that a human being or a machine can undo that screw, those two pieces can become separate and we can recycle them? Or are they molded together in such a way that we're going to have to melt this down to separate them out? And how easy is that process?
Yeah, for computer, it's actually a big thing, right? When we try to customize everything. Interesting. So, is it fair to say cradle-to-cradle design is more appropriate for the same company design the thing and the same company actually recycle the thing to be reused? Because I kind of feel like if I'm company A, I design something, but company B end up using it after people throw it away. So what's my benefit out of it?
Right. Well, and that's where this gets interesting, is where this sort of interconnects with our economic system, right? And with capitalism, and I think it sort of depends if we're thinking purely in economic terms, right? If I'm making a product and I'm thinking purely in economic terms, and this is where I'm a little out of my wheelhouse. You'd have to talk to an economist. But if I'm thinking purely in terms of dollars and cents, in most cases, at least at the present moment, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense for me to think about that recycling process, right? Because at the moment, our raw materials are still pretty cheap. And we've done a lot of things to make them continue to be really cheap. We've externalized those costs in a lot of ways, low-wage labor, not skirting around environmental regulations, things that make that cheaper to get those. I think at a certain point, and some products have reached this already, where there's enough value in the product that it makes a lot of sense to recycle it. Mm-hmm. And it may be another company that's realizing that value. But the idea of cradle to cradle is design a product that you can rebuild sort of infinitely, right? I mean, that would be the ideal, right? But at least a few times, something that you can, you design this TV, TV technology changes, somebody wants a new TV, you can harvest the plastic, the steel from the bolts, the aluminum, the lead from the solder. You can harvest all those things and redesign them into a new thing and then sell it back to that person. So you sort of have to get away from thinking about it, at least at the moment, in purely economic terms, right? You also have to think about it in terms of the environmental good, right? And so it's that sustainability folks often talk about the triple bottom line, right? People, profit, and planet. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of expanding our business model to realize that in the long term, things that impact the planet do impact your business, right?
Interesting. So yeah, from my point of view, basically it's either one company grow big enough so they actually expand vertically, so they actually take care of the first round and second step and third step, building different products using their waste, or it can be like they receive a certain kind of incentive from the government. It's just like you spend additional time to design this thing and the additional cost to design this thing, but if it's sustainable, I'm going to give you some kind of like tax refund or policy or something like that.
Yeah, that'd
be really nice.
That'd be an interesting way to go about it. Or maybe it's like you said, maybe it's maybe it's a separate company, maybe it's a government entity that does the recycling. But if there's an incentive to design it in such a way that it can be recycled, even if you as the company are not doing the recycling, there's still usefulness for that item at the end of its life.
It's the same thing like when you try to talk to the guy who collects the garbage, they will say, wow, you can see when they designed it, they didn't care about how we're going to put it in the box. Right? So it would be really nice for them to actually put those kind of things in their mind to make our life easier. That would be like a more interesting way.
And companies are starting to, I have, in my class, I have the students do, I call them curiosity voyages because I'm a big fan of Stranger Things. I don't know if you watch Stranger Things, but yeah. So we do these curiosity voyage projects where they can sort of define their own topic. I have some suggested ones, but they can come up with their own. And one of them did a project on Amazon sustainability efforts. And
you mean Amazon the company?
Amazon the company, yeah. And they are slowly moving in that direction. But one of the things that they have finally realized, which, like you said, any garbage collector can tell you, is that they should right size the packaging to fit the product. You know, how many times have you gotten your Amazon package and I got a flash drive the other day that's about 1.5 inches big, and it comes in a huge box, right? So yeah, there's all of those sorts of efforts too in terms of reduction, in terms of material usage. Yeah.
With the coming era of big data, you do have access to all those informations. So it's just a matter of like how to use it and make it more efficient.
Mm-hmm. And I think that ties in. I hadn't thought about it in this way, but I think that also ties into this potential for reuse, right? We could potentially start to track some of these things, right, and figure out and make that information available to a company. If you design it with these items and you fasten them together in this way, this is how long on average that's going to take, how many person hours or how many machine hours that's going to take, and how much we can even probably, I would assume people that are smarter than me can put a number to that, right? This is the cost of breaking it all back down. And wouldn't that be interesting information for a designer to have, to be able to say, well, if I make this, I have a Mac computer. If I make this Mac computer out of aluminum versus plastic, and I fasten it together in this way versus this way, then it's going to be this much more recyclable or worth this much more at the end of its life. So
for Mac, actually, I kind of feel like, is Apple doing the thing? I feel like all the Mac got recycled actually goes back to Apple.
They do, yeah. You can send your Mac back to Apple, and that's one of those really good examples of a product that has enough. There's enough value in the parts that it makes sense for Apple to do that. They're probably making some money off of that. I don't know if they're putting it right back into other Macs. If you go back and the aluminum from your Mac becomes the next gen, I don't know if they're doing that. But I do know that, in fact, a little card came when I got my new Mac last spring that said this can be, at the end of its life, it can be recycled and send it back. And so there are companies that are doing that. Right now, I think it's driven a lot by economic indicators is my guess. But I think the more sort of social awareness grows about sustainability, and we're seeing this too with. I was just, for my own personal purposes, I was researching clothing sustainability because I wear a lot of jeans, and I do a lot of work in the theater department where I get things dirty and I get holes in things easily, so I go through jeans like crazy. And so I was trying to research, what companies are out there that are making jeans and they're making them sustainably. And I can get some really sustainably made jeans if I want to pay $300 for a pair of jeans. But when I'm going through them every 3 months, that's not. So I was looking of the big companies that are out there, the ones that are making them for a price that is affordable to me. Who's doing it well. And I think there are probably various companies that are doing it well. But I know that Levi in particular has started to turn an eye towards sustainability, and I think a lot of that comes from sort of public pressure, public awareness. I can't imagine it comes an awful lot from a economic incentive because it's making clothing sustainably is substantially more expensive. It's one of those things where it's not a little bit more expensive to make it sustainably because of the way that we've cheapened a lot of the clothing making process. So I think there are companies out there, at least in my kind of really informal research, that are starting to see the social benefit in it, which is, of course, ultimately an economic benefit too, right? If people see them as sustainable.
Say if you got a jeans which is like sustainable, which sold for $35, you got another jeans sold for $25 but not sustainable. If it's only $10 difference or $5 difference, it's going to be a big incentive to actually buy the sustainable one.
Yeah, and
I'm just thinking about it, right? I'm going to buy the other one.
Right, and I'm kind of for that example, I'm the living example of that. There is a price point at which, right, I'm willing to pay more, and I think we see that too. Like for example, people who get their groceries at a co-op, right? Oftentimes that comes at a bit of an increased cost, but there's a certain cost that people are potentially willing to pay. Now, if it was 10 times or 20 times or 30 times, then it maybe starts to become a different calculation. So that's another one of those things where with big data, the data on that would be really interesting. On different products, where is that point, for a lot of people?
That's really interesting because with all the big franchise right now, one small little tiny saving will actually save a lot in terms of volume. And before talking to you, I don't even think about this, but now I think about it. When we grow up, like I got a T-shirt. After a while, that thing wears off, and you turn that thing into like a clothes you use to mop the whole table. And after that, you just keep modifying by yourself, right? So in this kind of way, it's kind of like a reuse and recycling. Maybe not in the design, but still, we do things in that way.
Yeah, and our grandparents were the original sustainability-minded people, right? My grandmother grew up in the Great Depression, and I don't think she ever in her life threw away a plastic bread bag. Everything was in bread bags. So you buy a loaf of bread, it comes in a plastic bag. Well, now I don't need to buy Ziploc bags because I've got a plastic bag here, So I think some of this is, some of this is new and some of this is emerging technology, and some of it is sort of recapturing some of that spirit of, and this maybe kind of dovetails into the discussion of craft, but it's recapturing some of that spirit of, I have control of my environment, right? This bread bag isn't just a bread bag. I can make it into whatever I want to make it into.
Let's talk about that, actually. Talk about our relations to our stuff. What causes us to cherish one object and throw away another? And also, does putting our own work into part of the process of like Ikea make us value it more?
Yeah, and so I think that's one of the geniuses of Ikea. We can get into Ikea because I have two halves on Ikea, as a friend of mine would say. I have two halves, and one of the things that they've figured out, they figured out a lot of things really well. They've figured out how to make things that people like, styles that people desire, inexpensively, but I think one of the other things that they have figured out is that we value the process of making, even though, we may not have some of the same skills as our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents had in terms of making physical objects, because everything has become so sort of diversified. But we value that process. On the other hand, one of the things that Ikea has done is sort of they're sort of one of the poster childs for sort of the commodification or the consumption of stuff, right? I'm going to buy this. I'm not going to expect that it's going to last a long time, but that's okay because my tastes will have changed in 10 years, and then I won't feel bad throwing it out because I only spent $20 on this end table, right? Or something like that. Whereas I think our grandparents and previous generations, a dining room table was, it may have been passed down from your parents and your parents' parents and your parents' parents, and it was sort of a central object in your household, and as long as it served the purpose of a dining room table, you wouldn't think about getting rid of it, right? Because it was this material thing, and you had invested quite a bit in it. And I think one of the things that IKEA has done by making things so inexpensive is it's made it easier for us to see them as a service, like we were talking about with the TV, right? I need the service of being able to sit somewhere while I eat my dinner, right? It's not so much that I think about, oh, I'm buying a table and that's made out of wood or metal or whatever. We're thinking about, I need a thing to sit at while I eat my food. And when we think about it like a service, then it's just like, going to get your hair cut. You don't have any lasting attachment to that because it's a service, you pay for it, it happens, and it's over. And the ease with which we've made things disposable makes it really easy for us to view those things as a service. But on the other hand,
price also comes in.
And price also comes into it.
Right? It's almost like leasing of furniture.
Right.
Even if it doesn't break, it's almost as expensive as leasing.
Right. Except unlike leasing, we didn't build a thing where when I'm done with it, it can go back and somebody else can lease it, because chances are at the end of 5 years or 10 years, and this isn't true for IKEA makes a really wide range of stuff. So they make some stuff that lasts a long time, but they also make some stuff that you're lucky if it lasts for a couple of years, right? Mm-hmm. And so yeah, I think that's a part of it. It's also, on the flip side of that, they've made something that you put your sweat and maybe blood, if you scrape your finger up putting it together, you put your time into putting together, and you have a bit more of a connection with something when you put your time into it. One of the things that got me really interested in this topic was thinking about craft and craftsmanship. So I think I said earlier, my dad was a carpenter, and I didn't realize until probably high school that it was strange that you would live in a house that your dad built, right? I didn't realize. My dad built our house, and looking back on it, it's totally, I'm in my 30s. He built the house that I grew up in when he was 27, and I look back on myself at 27. I think, could I have done something like that? I don't know, but yeah, my dad built the house that I grew up in, and I didn't realize, I think until high school, that this isn't a normal thing. I kind of realized, I guess, that there were contractors and building companies but I didn't realize that most people didn't have that kind of connection, and when something broke in our house, my dad was fairly adamant about, he was not hiring someone to do something he could do himself, right? And so when something broke, it wasn't even a question that we would call someone. We wouldn't, because my dad would go and fix it. And if he didn't know how to fix it, he'd call somebody that did, and he'd pick their brain and he'd figure it out, And so it was sort of a revelation to me when I became a homeowner that I could hire people to do things. And I still struggle with that. I still try to do as much on my own as I can. But it was it's just sort of a different relationship that you have with something when you made it or when a family member made it. And I do think IKEA sort of taps into that feeling. And I know, in my, well, I don't know how long IKEA has been around, but I know it was becoming big in my college days. And I remember and Facebook was at the same time, right? And I remember all of the Facebook posts, people getting fresh out of college and they get their first apartment, they go to IKEA, they load up, a carload full of stuff, they come back, and they're so excited to post about the fact that they built it, right? Like it was 3 hours and I put it together wrong first, but I got it and it's done, and now my living room looks great, And there is a sense of satisfaction with that I think IKEA has tapped into. And it does make me wonder if that sense of satisfaction is so much greater because we have a greater distance now between ourselves and the stuff in our lives than maybe our parents' generation, or certainly our grandparents or our great-grandparents' generation. my grandfather on my mom's side grew up on a farm, and on the farm, in the 1920s on a farm, if you're several miles from a major city and something breaks in the wintertime, you figure it out, because getting to and from places was not an option at some points. And so there was kind of there's this direct relationship with our stuff when we either build it or we fix it, right? It's a direct engagement with the thing. And it gives us, there's a writer that I really like named Matthew Crawford. And he wrote a book called Shop Class as Soulcraft. And one of his arguments is engaging with physical things, whether it's to build them or to fix them, gives us a sense of agency. So it gives us a feeling that we can make a difference in the world, right? Even though it may not be this sort of, we usually think of that like I can make a difference, like it's a big philosophical thing, right? But it gives us a really concrete, like, if I this is a really silly example of it because it's not really building something, but I raked my yard last weekend, not this weekend because it had snowed since then, right? But I raked the yard, and there is a definite sense of satisfaction when you can look at it and go, this was covered in leaves at the beginning of the day, and at the end of the day, it's not covered in leaves, and I did that through my own actions, right? And anytime I've fixed something, so a recent example of this would be I replaced the walk-through door to my garage, right? It was rusting out at the bottom. I went to the lumberyard. I got a new one. I pulled it all out. It took me a whole day, but I replaced it, and it does sort of give you a sense of ownership of the thing, right? And there's this whole and I don't remember if we talked about this beforehand, but there's the right to repair movement that's sort of gaining some traction. This idea that if you own a product, you should have the right to repair it. So there are all these products that are designed so that you can't take them apart, you can't fix them. Maybe they have some kind of non-standard screw where a regular old Phillips screwdriver won't pull it apart, right? Or you're nodding like you've tried this before. And so
I
there's...
don't want to spend another $50 to buy the screwdriver just for this.
Right. Or maybe it's not even... Maybe it takes a special machine and you can't even buy the screwdriver, right?
Yeah.
And so there are several states around the country that have experimented with... and I can't remember if I wrote down which states... I was looking this up before we were talking, but there are several states around the country that are experimenting with right to repair laws. So if you're going to sell a product, it has to be, you can't say that it voids the warranty if someone attempts to repair it themselves.
Oh, as hard as that?
Or as simple as you have to design it in such a way that it could be repaired with certain reasonable tools. That's where it gets into a bit of a gray area because sort of how do you define some of that? But one of the things that folks in the right to repair movement, one of their sort of catchphrases is if you can't repair it, you don't own it. And it kind of goes back to that idea of if I buy something and I can't repair it when it breaks, I'm really just leasing it or renting it. I just don't know what the terms of the rental are when I buy it, right? Mm-hmm. If I buy a washing machine and I can't repair it when it breaks, then when it breaks, my lease on it is done, right? My interaction with it is done. So I've really just rented it. I just don't know how long the rental term is. I know how much I have to pay, but I don't know how long the rental term is. You contrast that to something that is sort of like infinitely repairable. So I do woodworking. So whenever I buy a piece of furniture, I try to buy something that's made out of solid wood, because if it's made out of solid wood, it's pretty much infinitely repairable. You can patch it, you can replace a piece, you can always get wood, and red oak right now and red oak 300 years ago are the same tree, more or less. And so that piece of furniture is then pretty much infinitely repairable with the right tools, right? And so one of the right to repair folks have that slogan with the idea that if you can repair it, then it's truly yours, right?
Because the personal connection with it.
Yeah, and nobody can really take that away from you, and the device can't take it away from you by breaking, because if it does break, you say, okay, I'm going to fix it, and here's how, right? So
interesting. So I never thought about this before, but putting your effort into something, even though that thing is gone, the memory is still there. The personal relationship is still there. Just like whenever the car breaks down during the winter, you try to fix it. That thing become like a permanent memory. And you can also remember the guy or your other partners when that thing breaks down. You work together and figuring these things out together. That thing become almost like invaluable actually memories. Same thing with putting IKEA furnitures together. Sometimes you don't do it alone. You find your roommates, you find your girlfriend, and we just take a really nice afternoon, put it on several furnitures, and then we go out and eat dinner, and that would be like a very fulfilling afternoon for me.
And it's part of the experience, right? And the experience then, like you said, makes a memory and encodes a memory in your brain about that moment, and I think then gives you that connection with the item, right? And the other thing it gives you is a skill, right?
Cool.
So if so the one thing, I like to do a lot of stuff on my own. I do a lot of home repairs on my own. The one thing I rarely do on my own is car repairs, because for whatever reason, and I'm sort of slowly getting over it, but for whatever reason, I just have a vision of me doing a car repair wrong and my car going off the road at 80 miles an hour, but the one sort of extensive car repair beyond like kind of like basic stuff like wiper blades and things like that I've done was there's the strut on the wheel that absorbs energy as you go over bumps, right? And there's a tie to that, which is basically a metal rod. And that metal rod ties it to the frame. And I took my car to the repair shop. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And it was making a clunking noise. And they said, well, it's just the strut ties. It's not a safety thing. But over time, they have these little rubber balls at the end, and the rubber balls wear out, and you have to replace them. And I said, oh, okay, how much is that going to be? And they said $800. Well, it was right after I had started my job here. I didn't have $800. But they told me it wasn't a big safety issue, and I thought, well, maybe this is a thing that I can tackle myself. And so I went to the auto parts store. Turns out the part itself is $70. So and I understand, there's in terms of the economic side of it, I understand why they were charging me $800, because now I've put in the time to fix it, and I understand the time, and you divide that by you divide that $800 by the time, and they probably would have done it a lot faster than I did. But when I got done, I went, okay, I understand why they were charging me that much. But I got it in and out successfully. It took me, I think they said it was going to take them, 3 or 4 hours. It took me a long day. It took me 10 or 12 hours to get done. You got to take the wheel off and jack up the car. And but when I was done, I had the satisfaction of, this is a thing I did it myself. I did it correctly. Hopefully, I've been driving the car for several years, so I must have. But then now it's also a skill that I have, and I also, my wife will tell you that usually these projects include acquiring some tools for that process. So I had to acquire a particular type of wrench for this process, and now I have that, and I can use it on other things that I might need. And so it's the sort of social, emotional aspect to it, but it's also that idea of building skills. And one of the really interesting things that I have found is when you start to work on the things that inhabit our lives, a lot of them become a lot less mystifying, right? So I also took apart my washing machine when it broke. And it turns out a washing machine is, at least the older style washing machines, are a timer, a motor, a belt, and a big drum that spins. And the belt connects the drum to the motor, and the timer basically tells the motor when to spin. And there's a couple of parts that open and close a valve to help the water go in and out at the right time, right? But a motor for a washing machine and a motor for a drill press for drilling holes in things, they're the same motor, right? So once you've figured out how to fix one, you know how to fix the other. And that goes for so many different things, especially with like woodworking, right? Once you've figured out how to screw two things together, well, half the world is made out of wood screwed together, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of those skills transfer, and it does sort of start to demystify. Now, there's a whole host of things that I could take apart and have no idea how they went together. But the more you do, the more you go, oh, I see what they did here. They used this design process from this other area, right? And they incorporated that in this area, and I know a little bit about this area, so maybe I can figure out this area. So it's also about that idea of gaining skills, and that's what really I think gives you the sense of agency, right? The sense of I actually can have an impact on my physical world around me. And conversely, when you don't have that, I do feel like there is a sense of helplessness, right?
Yep.
And we've all been there. The thing that we're depending on, whether it's our car or our washing machine or the furnace in our house, it broke and it's the middle of the night and there's literally nothing we can do about it except call someone else, right? And there's always going to be those things, right? I don't think any one person can know how everything in the world works. I'm trying, but I don't think it's going to happen. But there's always going to be some of those things. But I think the more of those things that there is this sort of sense of helplessness. Of I don't think what I do has any impact on the physical world, right? And what's interesting to me is, does that transfer to other parts of our life? And so, going back to the book Shop Classes Soulcraft. See, now you got me going on this, and but going back to that, one of the arguments of the book is that maybe there is some carryover between that part of our life and some other parts of our life. If we feel helpless when it comes to some of these certain physical things, well, then do we really also feel helpless when it comes to these larger political things, right? Do we feel like, well, I can't personally make a difference with climate change, right? But if you have that firsthand knowledge of how your furnace works and how your car works, and how your electronic devices work, maybe it's a little easier to make that leap to, oh, these are things that we could change. I know how this works. I could see how we could design a different process.
Just do your part.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I totally understand what you said about the helpless thing. Like at the middle of night, you have nobody to call, and you have no idea how expensive this thing is going to be. Like anything with a car, it can be $100, it can be $300, it can be $1,500, right? That's really scary part when I was in my PhD, because my salary was relatively low. So every time your car breaks, you said, "Oh, bring it to the dealership," and you're worrying like, "Are they trying to rip me off?" And you bring it to another mechanic. I need to see like 2 or 3 mechanics before I finally fix, where I want to fix that thing. And if they say the same thing, fine. But if they say a different thing, then you really get lost. Right?
And that's what really makes you feel helpless too. If you don't, and I've been in this place with a car a number of times where I don't know enough about how certain parts of a car work to know if they're ripping me off, right? To know if if this really is going to take them 15 hours, or is it going to take them 5 hours, but they're charging me for 15 hours, right? So yeah, it's a real feeling, and it's a regular feeling for a lot of us, I think.
And also, I kind of feel like if you have the skill, you'll make more friends. Right? People are going to call you and say, "Hey, Ben, come here, and I got a furniture. I remember you did a case before, which is very similar to this one. Do you want to come in and bring your tools, or even just borrow your tools? Just being simply because you have the wrench." So people become so much more interconnected because we do something outside our profession, which affect our life.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have the skill, we can certainly exchange our skills and talk and spend time together just doing those kind of things. But if you outsource this part, then there will be a professional coming here. You lose that opportunity to talk with your friends and just try to fix something, right?
Well, and I have the perfect example of this. I have a friend named Tyler who's a music teacher. And Tyler, like me, likes to do a lot of things by himself. So he bought this acreage, this old farmhouse, and he gutted it. Basically, he took it all the way down to the first floor, took up the entire top floor, all the interior, everything. And, he had done a lot of stuff with his hands before then, but had never done anything of this kind of scale. But over the course of this process of tearing this all down and putting it back together, he's picked up all these skills. So the frame of the house and the roof and the siding and sort of the basic, the first parts, that happened in about a year. It happened pretty darn quickly. But he started to pick up all these skills, and he also started to accumulate all these tools. And I think he's now at year 5 or 6. And he's still working on finishing. There's a porch he's finishing. He hasn't built kitchen cabinets yet because he wants to build those himself. And kitchen cabinets are expensive. But what's happened in the meantime is all kinds of people have gone, oh, hey, you work on your house. Hey, I've got this sidewalk. Could you come help me pour this concrete for the sidewalk? Or, oh, you've got this specialized metalworking tool. Could you make me 10 of these things that I need for this part, for this other thing? And so he does. He gets off on these side projects, and it's not because he's not a hard worker, but he's got all kinds of new friends that he never knew he had,
And you
so
don't need money. You just say, sometimes treat me beer.
Right.
I'll be happy to come here and just talk while we're working, right?
Right.
Know your kids, know your family and everything.
Well, and there is, there's a certain camaraderie to that too. A lot of the friends I think we have, or at least a lot of the friends that I have, are friends because I share a common interest with them, right? There's something in common. And so I have found, at least in my life, that the narrower that interest is, the deeper your friendship is, because you're one of the few people that can really kind of geek out on that kind of thing. And so I have certainly found that with woodworking, with repair, that there are certain friends that I keep in my life and I talk to a lot because we're talking about those kinds of things, right? So yeah, I think there's a definite social aspect to it.
Yeah. If I think about it, a lot of times nowadays we just think about a classic example is just like, if I do the work myself, I spend 2 hours. I hire somebody, it's $20 per hour, it's $40 in total. But if I'm an analyst, I got paid for $100 per hour. So what I should do from an economic point of view is to use the 2 hours to do my work, get $200, spend $40, hire a guy to do this. But you actually kind of ignored all the other stuff that you can put into this process, not just money, right? So you got to have fun sometime. There got to be some part of your life which is in your control.
Right, and my wife would tell you that that I have oftentimes come out on the losing side of that economic proposition, right? Because I decide, oh, gosh darn it, I want to do this myself, and so I'm going to do it, even if it ends up taking me
More
3 times as long
and
and potentially more money. For me, though, it's so my day job is design in the theater world, so lighting design, sound design, sometimes scenic design for theater shows, and for me, whatever my freelance rate for that would be, whatever I get paid for that, it may make more economic sense to do that and then hire someone to do what they're specialized at, but for me, I'm interested in more things than just theater, right? And so maybe I don't want to do another 100 hours of what my day job is, right? Maybe I want to go do something else that also interests me. And like you said, maybe it doesn't have an economic rationale, but maybe it has a personal rationale, and maybe there's certainly for me, there's a satisfaction. Let's see, about 3 years ago, my sister commissioned me to build a little bench. They have kind of a farmhouse style dining table in their house, and they wanted a bench for one side, and I happened to have from another project, I had some ash wood, and I built the bench out of that, and it went to my sister's house, so I don't see it regularly, so I don't think about it regularly, but every time I do go to her house, I see it, and I think about the process, and it brings me right back to what was happening, at that time in my life, right? What else was going on? And so it is kind of an interesting connection that I wouldn't have had if I went to Ikea and I bought her a bench for Christmas, right? That was the bench I bought at Ikea, and that's the end of that. But when I see the bench, I think about, oh, that's where I learned how how to chisel a mortise and tenon, and I bought my first set of chisels, and now that's a skill that I have. Oh, and at that same time, it was the summer, and I remember it was really hot because that was the summer our air conditioning went. And it brings you sort of all of these memories because you were involved in the process.
And think about how your sister is going to see this. Maybe you're far away, but they see the bench. You think about you, like, oh, I got a brother, and he made me this. He carried me that much to spend the time to make this. And also, compared to you just order her something from Amazon, and they actually did the delivery.
Right.
You didn't even show up.
I wasn't
say,
even.
Hey, open your door, or they called her and open the door, and your table is here.
Right.
Then basically, what you did for her is just credit card, and $200.
Yep. It was almost purely monetary, right?
Right. So you don't have those kind of things. Another thing I was constantly thinking is about your friend Tyler.
Mm-hmm.
When he was trying to build a house, no matter how long that thing takes, and probably he's going to lose money if you can use the time to do something else.
Right.
But think about during the process, you and your partner and even your kids. I don't know how many of you guys have these experiences. I don't, but I just admire those kind of kids. Say, I built our house with my father.
Right.
When I was from 7 to 14. I started with painting, but then eventually I started to know this. It's almost like the whole family trying to put all their effort to build something which only belongs to their own. It doesn't really matter if the economic value or the functionality is working, because maybe it's leaking.
Yeah.
Right. All the time.
And it's one of the things I really I think about this a lot, because the La Crosse area has a pretty big, the greater area in Wisconsin has a pretty big Amish population, and the Amish have this tradition of the barn raising, right? And when somebody needs a barn built on their farm, the entire community is there. It's 30 people, it's 40 people, it's 100 people, and they'll put up a barn in a day because they've got all these people. And one, it's really efficient because, the more people you have, many hands make light work. But it's also a social event, right? The children are there. The Amish communities have fairly defined gender roles, so the women are also there, probably not putting up the barn, but it is a family event. It's a community event. You're building bonds. You're making memories about, remember that thing that happened when, George or whoever almost fell off the barn when we were building it, and right, you're making all those memories. And I do wonder if there is a relationship between our disengagement with our stuff and our sort of distancing and disengagement with each other. There's a lot been written about the impact of social media and sort of isolation, depression rates, all of those sorts of things. I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist, but it does make you wonder, is there some kind of relationship between, we used to organize our communities around stuff, right? Like building stuff, fixing stuff. Your ability to do that was your currency, right? Oh, you're the mechanic, you can do that. You have those skills. Those skills were your currency. But they were also your way into the social fabric of the community,
you become
right?
A leader. Whenever we build something, you will be the guy who determine who gets what.
Right.
And you would be in charge of the design. We would be the labor, right?
Right. And if you're, let's say you're the mechanic in the community, if anybody wants their car fixed, they got to go to your shop, right? Or a mechanic shop, and that's a moment for social interaction. That's a moment to get to know someone. If we have more of a, mechanic isn't a good example because we don't really treat cars as a throwaway.
Furniture.
But furniture, a TV is a good example. In fact, when I moved here, our TV broke. At that point, there was one TV repair shop still in town. They have since closed. But I took it there. Modern TVs, the sort of repair is you swap out the motherboard. It's the whole TV basically, besides the outer shell. But
and replace it with a new motherboard.
Yeah, and so they're not really very repairable, which is why those sorts of places are going out of business. But if I then don't get that repaired, that's a missed sort of social opportunity, right? I sit at home, I order my next one on Amazon, it shows up while I'm at work. And I didn't have that interaction with someone from my community, right? Somebody built it somewhere.
Negotiation.
Yeah.
Customer service.
Yeah.
Trust. all these kind of things you kind of lose.
Right. And maybe while we're talking about, fixing my TV, I find out that they play a musical instrument and I play a musical instrument and we start a band. And, there's all of those sorts of social connections that happen when we're regularly relating to one another that I sort of wonder if we have more of a linear throwaway mentality. When I'm done with this TV, I order a new one. Somebody somewhere makes it, but I don't know them. I've never met them. Somebody delivers it. I don't know them. I've never met them, if we're really missing a lot of those opportunities for that social engagement.
Interesting, yeah. It kind of puts me into the thoughts because, like, if you're working with other people to build a well for your farm or working with other people, you kind of work together, not professionally, though. This is not the thing you do for a living or charge for anything, right? It's not like meeting my next KPI or something. It's more about we sit together and do something important to you or me, and then next time you will do something for me in return. And it's a very healthy relationship, and also we work together, but we have a common goal. It's not just like we're hanging out with no purpose. We come here, and the theme is building a furniture today.
Right.
So that is actually very clear, targeted social events.
And and there's a goal involved.
Yeah. Which I kind of miss because nowadays, like if you come to my house, what do? We just chat.
Right.
At least give me a theme. Otherwise, I feel like we just chatted for 3 hours. Time passed by. I don't know what we did.
Right.
But if you come here like today, the theme is fix this. Or even just for me, video games. Today, come here, we're going to beat the final boss of this game.
Right.
We spend 3 hours, try in turns, and just do that.
Right.
That'll be so good compared to I just go online and find some friends. I don't even know you. I don't see your face. I don't see you get excited. I don't see you get mad other than just hear from the headset.
Yeah.
I want to see you in my house, and we share food. We share conversations, not just about the game while we are playing the game.
Right.
I miss that.
Well, and I think the video game is a really good example too because it's you have, like you said, there's a definite goal in mind, right? And when you think about it, if you, at least for me, when I go back and I think about some of the best times of my life, the things that I remember, the stories that I tell when I am sitting around with someone and I'm just talking, right? All of those come from something where there was a definite goal, right? It was a road trip. It was this project we were working on, right? So I think, in fact, I was saying this to my wife the other day. We were talking about people that we know and acquaintances that we have, and the interesting people I know. The people that you meet and you go, I want to know more about you, and I want to know more about you and your thoughts on this and that, and are people that do a lot of different things, right? And some of
a person do a lot of things, or different person but doing very specific things.
One person that does a lot of different types
things.
Of things, right?
Okay, yep.
So we've all been in that situation where we sit down, for 3 hours to talk, but the only thing that person has to talk about is their job, or it's because that's the only thing they're interested in, right? And that's an oversimplifying. Everybody's interested in something else, right? But the people that I find really interesting are the people that I go, oh, well, you're, I don't know, you're a school teacher, but you also do woodworking, and you're also interested in, like you said, this particular video game, or whatever.
You tour the United States in your motorcycle.
Right, right, exactly. They have some kind of
diving and
other, exactly, and I think that makes for a really rich conversation, and I also think it makes for really rich memories when you're getting together to work on something specific. So my friend Tyler, that's building this house. I see him, a couple of times a year. He doesn't live in the area, but, sometimes I'll see him and I'll just go over to his house. We'll have coffee. We'll talk about things. But the things I really remember, the one in particular I really remember was, he sort of expanded the house and we had to pour a new basement. And I had I had made like a little slab out of concrete before, but I'd never done anything on that scale. And the interesting thing about concrete is you're working against the clock, right? It's setting up quickly, and you need to make sure that it has filled this form and there aren't any gaps, there aren't any voids or anything like that before it starts to get hard. And also you've got this guy in the concrete truck waiting on you because he's got somewhere else to be, right? And so it's this kind of like really hurried process, but you also have to make sure you do it well, because once it sets up, you can't, you know, concrete is concrete. You know, it's the word that we use for something that's really hard, right? So I remember that experience really well, because we were racing against the clock, and we were, you know, and I was learning all kinds of new things really in a really fast-paced way. And that's the kind of thing that we'll talk about when we're back together and we are just having coffee. And if all we ever did was get together and have coffee, what would we have to talk about, right? So yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way till you asked that question.
Yeah, that was really interesting conversation here, because for nowadays, a lot of things are driven by economy. So our definition of owning a thing, our definition to possess is just, I have the ownership of the thing. It's under my name. Title says owner,
right.
Song Chen.
I purchased
End
it.
of story, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about it, to possess is the same as to be possessed. You need to put part of you into that thing to really establish your true ownership. That means if this thing is gone, you will not just be sad just because you lose money. You're sad because I lost my car, my first car. Do you know how much that means to me? Right? How much effort I put into it, how much memory I put into this car, how much memory I put into this furniture, this TV. And during the old days, we also have the family tradition. If the thing lasts long enough in multi-generations, that thing has so much more value just than the functionality and everything, right? It's almost like a lot of humans put their soul into this thing, and now if I carry that thing, I better treat it well.
Right. What's the Marie Kondo thing? Does it spark joy?
Uh-huh.
When you're thinking about whether or not to throw out an item, does it spark joy? Chances are it sparks a lot more joy if you help to make it, or if there's a memory involved in that thing. It makes me think of, so the very first thing that I did in my first year seminar class, we start out thinking about just things generally. We're not thinking about the design of them yet. We're not thinking about, are they sustainable? We're just thinking about stuff as a really general idea. What is the stuff in our lives? And the first project I had them do on the first day of class was, and I think I stole this from somewhere else and I don't remember where, but I call it the Desert Island Project. If you were going to a desert island, what are the most important things that you would take? And it really forces you to think about, what are the very most important things in my life? I mean, you need food, water, and shelter. So,
How many people say a smartphone?
But
assuming you have data plan there.
Yeah. That was actually one of the first questions I got. Is there cell service there? I don't know. Assume not. It's a desert island. You're on your own, right? I was surprised at how many technical questions I got. Well, does it have, is it going to have running water? Is it going to, and so, but the idea is to sort of start to sort through what's really important. So I had them separate, what would you take to a desert island? What would you take to a New York studio apartment? You know, you've got like 200 square feet. It's a glorified closet, right? And maybe it's a little bigger than your desert island list, but it's still not as big as your full list of stuff. Well, then what would you take to your first apartment? Okay, then what would you take to your first house, right? And so getting them to sort of think through, well, what's really important to me, what's less important to me, and without fail, you know, there's our basic necessities, right? Food, water, shelter, those are always on the list. But without fail, the other things that are on the list are photographs, right? Several of my students said, "Oh, I would take a particular musical instrument, or I would take this piece of music," because music is often, I think, tied to memory. Even the ones that said smartphone, when you drill down on, okay, why would you take your smartphone? Well, that's how I talk to people, right? Or that's where all my photographs are, all my memories, right? And so certainly I think, and it can go the other way. And again, this is another one of those things, because this is a passion of mine and an interest of mine that my wife will tell you can go the other way. You can have trouble letting go of things because you built them, or because, well, we don't really have a need for that anymore, but I can't get rid of it because I made that, you know? So it can be a double-edged sword too, for sure.
In that case, I think it's pretty nice. You will find somebody who will take good care of it or make good use of it. You're start selecting the next users based on how much they care,
Right.
Not by how much more they're going to pay.
Right.
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 Interesting. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people do that. So I, because I'm big on reuse, whenever I'm done with something, I try to make sure it has another home. So I either sell it on Craigslist, or I'm a big fan of Habitat for Humanity. Has these restores. There's one up in Onalaska, here in the La Crosse area, where they will take donations of household items, furniture, building materials, tools, that kind of thing. And one of the things I've noticed as I sell things on Craigslist is that when you go to buy something from someone, they want to tell you the story of the object, right? Well, I got this, and it was from, when my husband bought it, and when we moved into our first apartment, and now we don't need it. And they want to tell you like what it means to them, because they want you to know that it has meaning, right? And it's a thing that we all do, especially with larger objects, right? Maybe we don't do it with, I buy a coffee. I don't have any personal connection with the coffee cup that it was in, right? But especially with larger objects, people want to tell you the story of the object because it has meaning to them, and they want to see that it has meaning to you. Do you get this? That this is a meaningful object? Are you going to take good care of it?
That's the fun part. When you go and purchase, you listen to all the stories behind this chair.
And I don't know how many times I bought something, because most of the furniture in my house that I haven't built, I bought on Craigslist, and almost every time, they want to tell you their story. They want to hear a little bit about your story. But I can't tell you the number of times someone said, well, I'm just glad it's going to a good home, right? We want to feel like our stuff lives on after that. So it's interesting that you said that, because I've had that experience for sure.
When you were talking about going to the desert island, I think another interesting question, if you want to ask your student, is back in ancient times in our culture, let's say you meet someone you would like to marry. You cannot marry right away because you need to go back and ask your parents and everything, right? So, and usually they don't live together. It's more like you're from a city, I'm from a city, we all go to school together. What you need to do is you need to give the other one a thing of yours and say, this will be, I won't say a deposit, but this is like the proof that once you go to my house, you show this, they will let you in. Yeah.
Well, and there's a tradition of that. I'm thinking about some of my extended family. My ancestors are Irish.
Uh-huh.
In Ireland, there's the tradition of the dowry, right? When you get married, it comes with a dowry. It comes with all of this stuff, right? That means you're not only forming a relationship with this person, but because you're doing that. This person, usually it was, I think in the Irish tradition, it's the woman, but in this tradition, you marry the woman comes with all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really only, again, this is where I'm a little out of my depth, but I'd be interested to talk to somebody who's an anthropologist to see if that's something that is common in a lot of other cultures. And my sense is that maybe it's only sort of a more recent thing that we don't think about stuff as a part of that. I'm joining myself with
Probably
you
because of the prosperity of how many stuff we own.
Right, and how easy it is to sort of like, I do think there was a point, certainly at least in the U.S., but I get the sense that maybe this is a kind of universal thing, where when you go off on your own, maybe you go to college, maybe, before the days when a lot of people went to college, you go get your first job, right? Your parents would sort of put together this, they'd send stuff with you, right? My mom did this when I went to college, right? Like she picked up all of her old silverware, so I had some silverware and some plates to go to college. And you sort of send yourself out, you send your kids out with stuff, because that's how you know they're going to be okay in the world, because they have some stuff, right? And I wonder now that with increased financial means, if we don't do that so much as you go out on your own, here's a bunch of money, buy your own stuff, right? And
Gift
then
cards comparative.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely.
I kind of feel like nowadays, if I got a friend who have a kid, before I would really think about what kind of gift I want to give them. Like the example I just said, like what kind of thing which belongs to me, which I value, I'm going to share with you as a proof of our love, right? It's just like this thing. For example, like this is my music instrument. It has been with me since I was 2 years old. Now, it belongs to you.
Right.
Right. Those kind of things. That's the moment I feel like, wow, you really build the connection and you let other people to see your world.
And it's hard too. I have found, so a friend of mine just got married, and I decided that that as a gift, I would give them a card that says, I knew they were going to be moving into their first house after they got married, and I decided I would give them a card that said, this entitles you to one piece of custom-made furniture. Whatever you want for your house, I'll make it one piece, not your whole house, but a bookshelf. Do you want a headboard for your bed? Do you want a dining room table? Whatever it is. And I have started doing that.
So it's a cool
Yeah, it is, exactly. And I've started doing that and trying to do more handmade gifts for Christmas and other holidays. And you start to realize how much our lives are not built around that anymore. Because the list sort of stacks up and up and up and up, and I really enjoy doing it, but it does become, if you're going to give of yourself in that way and of your time, it really becomes a big part of your life. And
that's why you cannot have too many friends.
That's right. You have to limit your
friends take time.
Yeah.
If you really want to have a deep connection with them, and you really want to maintain the healthy relationship for a long time, actually, it requires your attention.
Right.
It's not just like it comes for free.
Right.
So that's why I kind of like keep a very close friend circle. If one guy comes in, I need to actually let somebody go.
Right.
Otherwise, I won't have time to actually take care of everybody. And if you don't contact them for 6 months, a year, well, where does your friendship go, right?
Right. Well, and I don't remember who I was listening to. This relates to a discussion about social media, right? Because I was listening to somebody the other day that was talking about the idea of Facebook and Twitter and of knowing sort of sometimes intimate details about the lives of someone who you haven't seen in 10 years. And is that a natural thing to do? And sort of, how much of our lives do we devote to that? I mean, I would think, and again, this is where we should do this as a conversation with a cultural anthropologist. But I would think, if you live in a smaller community, right, and sort of before the age of Facebook and all of that, your friend group is naturally limited because if somebody moves out of town, you might call them on the phone occasionally, but even then, that's not highly practical. So you just sort of lose touch, and that's the natural course of events, right?
You only got so many people at your same age.
Right.
Fixed,
and
right? Yeah.
and there's a and we all sort of have limited time, and so it is sort of a question of. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the people that I know that spend a lot of time working with their hands seem to be people who, and maybe that's just out of a sense of being old-fashioned, but seem to be people who pay less attention to social media and less attention to Facebook and maybe it's just out of a sense of time, right? Because they're having in-person interactions with people about the stuff that they're making, and there's just not time to look at, the person that lived, 6 rooms down the hall my first year of college, what did they have for dinner last night? There's just not time for that, right?
At least for a certain group of people, this is richer experience.
Right.
Compared to
right.
be friends with, I don't know, thousands of people online.
Right.
And each one just grab this little tiny of your attention.
And I don't necessarily think that any of this is sort of universal. And I think it all has degrees, right? Not everyone is going to want to fix everything in their life. But maybe there's some people that want to fix a few things. Maybe there's people, my father-in-law is, by his own admission, not much of a carpenter, but has a master's in computer science and understands electronics really well. And so he will take apart and work with electronics, I think, much more often than he would want to, take apart his cabinetry or his furniture, right? So I think it manifests itself in different ways with different people, because different people have different interests. But I do think there is something universal about the having a deeper relationship with an object, so that you understand how it was put together, how it was made. If it breaks, you understand how it might be fixed.
That's interesting, yeah. It also reminds me of when it was back to my childhood, when people don't have access to so many stuff. Like within a neighborhood, probably there are only 3 TV, and naturally their yard become a natural gathering because people want to watch TV and they come together. Also, when I was a kid, my family was really poor, so I don't have a video game machine. I need to actually bike for 40 minutes to go to my friend's house and try to play video games with them. I kind of miss that. Like now everybody has a PS4. It doesn't really matter whose house we go to. We can actually I sit here, you sit there in a different location, and we can actually communicate through the thing. But I really miss the time when we can sit together and share the good. We can sit together and share the functionality, and through this process, we kind of start to appreciate, we start to enjoy more about the functionality of the good.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. And the idea that the scarcity of it too, not only potentially gives it value, right, but also leads to the potential for social interactions.
Like seminars, right? The reason we have seminars is because the book is so expensive, so we can only have one book in the department, so we have to come here and take turns to look at the book and to present. So that is such a great culture back then. But now everybody has a book. You don't even have to show up. Right. But you guys basically got the same thing, and now we make it digital.
Right. Well, and it was, growing up, my parents did all right for themselves. My dad was a carpenter. My mom was a social worker. So they were middle class, but we didn't make a ton of money. But it was not, it was not uncommon for us to share things back and forth with neighbors. So, I don't think until the last few years of his life, my dad had a house that was kind of set back in the woods and a reasonably long driveway. But he and 2 other neighbors went in together and bought a snowblower, because when you think about a snowblower, you're only using it, a certain part of the year for like an hour each day, right? And it just made sense that they would go in together and they would share that, right? And I think about that, and I think about the neighborhood that I live in, and I think about, how would my neighbors look at me if I went up to them and said, do you want to go in together on a snowblower, or do you want to, let's buy 2 snow shovels and share back and forth instead of buying 2 each, right? And I think we have gotten away from that mentality so much that it feels a little weird, and it almost feels like an imposition, right?
We call it advanced, right? It's just like we don't want to bother each other. We don't want to. Yeah. And how many people actually do some activities with their neighbors simply because it's out of necessity? Right. Like I run out of eggs. Do you have some eggs I can borrow to cook, and I will give it back to you? But nowadays, it's just everybody have, $2. You got this many. You don't have to borrow anymore. Right.
Well, and we've and this gets back to some of the things we talk about in class. The idea that I think even 20 years ago, even when I was younger, I don't think people had the size of wardrobe that they currently have. I don't think they had the amount of, but some companies have gotten so good at externalizing the costs of making a T-shirt. They can pay somebody a penny, and and they can use fabric that's made out of it. Maybe it's polyester, so it's made out of plastic, so it's cheaper than farming the cotton, right? And we've gotten so good at making a shirt so cheap that you can buy, it's become a thing, like, oh, we have a group, let's get T-shirts, right? Like, that say the name of our group, because we can get them for $5, right? Or $2, or, and you have to think about, like, even if it's a cotton T-shirt, right? Like, you have to grow the cotton, you have to harvest the cotton, you have to, I don't know the whole process, but I assume you have to make it into the thread, and then you have to loom it, and you have to sew it. And there's a lot of steps in that process, and a lot of people along that route. How can $4 possibly capture all of that labor? Well, it's because we've externalized all those costs, right? We've gone somewhere where we can find somebody that's so desperate that they will work for a penny.
And they only take a little tiny part of making that whole thing. They just
Right.
do one thing 100 times instead of
Right.
making a shirt for you. That go back actually part to your craftsmanship. It's just like, for nowadays, no matter we work or no matter we actually start to produce something, we got multiple people collaborating together, but each one only take a very narrow procedure compared to the whole big picture. So do you feel like, especially if you're doing crafts for fun, part of the fun come from seeing the bigger picture and come from the whole process compared to just like one tiny little step in the whole 20 steps?
I think so, and I think we search for that. You and I were talking just before the podcast started about how in the last 5-10 years there is now craft everything. There is, especially in this area, there's craft beer, right? And I don't know. I think you could probably tell the difference taste-wise between craft beer and Budweiser, but it may not be so dramatic. But I think part of what we like about it is we can go to a brewery, and serving us the beer is the person that took that beer from the fermentation process to the bottling to right, and they did the whole process, and I think we like. I think there's something about that we really like, knowing that it came from a human being, a single human being did this whole process. I think there is also satisfaction in the process. But, like we've discussed, sometimes that runs counter to the best the best economic argument, right? It's always going to be cheaper to divide the labor and do the Henry Ford process and do it on an assembly line, put your bottling on an assembly line, put your fermentation on an assembly line, and you've got 20 people that are running a plant that makes 20,000 of these. That's always going to be economically better. But how much of the taste difference is knowing that knowing that a person put thought into how does this beer taste different than this beer? What if I ferment it for this long at this temperature versus for this long, right? And sometimes a lot of those things that we like about products are entirely subjective. You mentioned when we were talking via email, you mentioned the design of cars, right? Yeah. A lot sometimes of what we like about a car can be entirely subjective, right? Because I like the way that this looks. I like where they put the shifter right here. I like, all of those sorts of things. And so sometimes our enjoyment of things is not as rational as we would like to think it is, right?
Or even reproducible.
Or reproducible, right? Right. And it's not, we like to think of ourselves as we're the rational consumer. We looked long and hard for the best one, and we did consumer reports, and we made sure we got the best one, and it's got the best rating, and
I did exactly the same thing. Consumer report and everything, and then bought another car.
Yep. And then you go there, and there's something about it, right? That yep.
Yeah.
But we oftentimes, and sometimes it can't be perfectly rational. This is the whole debate about socialized healthcare, right? Do you really understand enough about the process to be making a rational decision about this doctor versus this doctor, or this prescription versus this prescription, right? Yeah. And sometimes we're not informed enough on the process to be making a rational decision. Sometimes that's really important, like in healthcare. Sometimes, though, that's okay that we're not fully informed. I think, I work in the arts. I work in theater. It's okay to like something because it's beautiful to you, right? And I think we lose some of that the more we try to convince ourselves that the process is totally rational, right? The more we try to say, no, I bought this car because it gets this many miles per gallon and it gets this star safety rating, and it gets that star safety rating in a certain test under a certain condition, right? We don't really have enough data to know that we made the best choice. We just like having some data so that we can feel like we made the best choice. But to me, there's also a lot of value in, I made this choice because I don't know why, because I like it, right? You know, why did I pick this particular painting to hang up on my wall instead of this one? I like it, you
That's
know?
me.
Yeah, it's me. It feels it speaks to a memory. Why do I like this piece of music versus this piece of music, you know? It speaks to a particular kind of memory. It has sounds in it that I like. It has instrumentation that I like. This person has a voice that I am drawn to. And sometimes I wonder we get in such a rush to kind of explain all of that, why this is, right, that we don't give ourselves permission to like something because we like it, right?
Why can't you just shut up and look
Right.
and appreciate, right? Sometimes you are trying to explain why this painting is good. Why don't you just be quiet, look at it? You will know it's good or not. And if it's not good, fine.
Right.
No matter how many people likes it, right?
And there's a there's a space for being critical of all that, but I think, you know, you can't look at the way that we consume stuff and not think that, you know, a lot of the job of people who are in marketing is to give us a reason to buy that product, right? And, well, you know, I'm buying this particular TV because it has 60 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second, or it does 1080p instead of 720p, and they're real differences. But sometimes I wonder when I'm looking at a product, like, would I care about these differences if someone didn't tell me that I should care, right? And that's one of the things that I really like about the process of crafting something for myself is I get to choose which things I care about, right? And I get to choose the level of detail in which I care about them.
So they don't have to be all premium quality, but they have the right quality at the right level for the right parts.
For you, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That's great, yeah.
So, like, you know, maybe maybe when I made my I don't know, pick a piece of furniture, like if I build an end table for my living room, right? If I was buying an end table, I would read a description of it and it would say made out of such and such a wood and, you know, the perfect height for blah blah blah, and I would read it and I would go, oh, well, I do use this for whatever that thing is. Maybe I do need this one, right? Mm-hmm. But it's sort of that power of suggestion, whereas if you're making it for yourself, you don't have the opportunity to have that sort of marketing suggestion, you need this, because you have to start from the place of what do I need, right? And I think you're much more likely to end up with something that you're happy with if you start from the place of what do I need? Now I'm going to make a thing that fulfills those needs, as opposed to, well, what do I need? And then I'm going to go research these things. Oh, that's a good point. I never thought about needing that. I never thought about needing that. Well, do you, or have you convinced yourself that you do, right?
That's very interesting because what you explained was something very similar to a self-initiation. It's like, hey, what do you like? Wait a second, go online. Oh, after reading this, I think I like this one because they told me I should like that one.
Right.
So actually a lot of our preference or our, the things we like are actually we were convinced by other people convincing us we should like it, right?
Right.
Actually, we miss the self-reflecting part. Really, if you just talk to yourself, ask yourself, what kind of shape do you like? What kind of wood do you like? What kind of texture? What kind of color? Actually, I don't know. If you ask me right now, I don't know.
Right.
Once it's there, I know it.
Right.
Right? So it's actually a really interesting self-reflect process, which I clearly missed because I don't know.
Well, and how much has the influence on us changed too? Because I think, and not to make this whole thing sort of nostalgic, but I do think there was a point at which the type of furniture you had in your house was heavily influenced by the type of furniture your friend had or your neighbor had, right? Because that's what you were exposed to. That's what you knew. Now I wonder how much of it is influenced by the people that you follow on Instagram, right?
Social media.
Or or social media, you know, being an influencer is a career, right? And oftentimes those folks are paid by the people that make the products. Or maybe you're even being directly influenced by the people that make the products because you're seeing commercials. I forget the exact statistic, but I want to say that, oh man, I saw a statistic out there about the number of pieces of advertisement that we are exposed to in our lifetime. And I want to say the comparison was we're exposed to the same amount of advertising in a week that our grandparents were exposed to in a lifetime. And so when you think about that, like, how can that not influence what we think we need, right? If we're exposed to it that often, but then we're buying things to satisfy what this company has told us that we might want, as opposed to satisfying some sort of like social status, right? Like, oh, I'm buying it because I know my neighbor's got one like this and they really love their dining room table, so I'm going to buy a dining room table like that dining room table, right? And then there's a kind of like social status attached to that object. Now it's sort of this larger social status, but it's potentially driven by the people selling us the object as opposed to other people who own the object.
So you're buying the icon, a social icon, created by the company.
Yeah.
Whatever image they were trying to make, basically you're just purchasing the image. Do you really need it? Who knows, right?
Right.
Interesting.
And maybe, yeah. I mean, and it's not all nefarious, right? Like, lots of companies make lots of good products, and lots of the ways that they try to sell you are honest selling points about their product. This thing does this really well. Mm-hmm. But it's just so hard to know, right? Like, is that being built up for marketing's sake, or am I actually going to experience that?
Unless you start to actually do something on your own, unless you start those kind of self-reflect process, which for me, because I'm a big fan of self-reflecting, it's just like, are you a good person? Come back and talk to you. Don't be judged by the external world. Because you can never satisfy everyone, right? Are you a good person? What's your personality exactly? Are you happy? Basically, are you happy? Which stage are you in your life? Do you think you're doing the right thing? Do you think there's something you should be stop doing? And adding that to that is like, what kind of furniture do you like? What's your character, right? What's your value when you start to buy something? What do you value the most? That's actually how you define yourself. You need to actually define yourself through this process, instead of, or at least not fully determined by the process other people designed for you.
Right.
And then you just take that process and say, this is me.
Right.
So that's actually a very interesting part. But in nowadays, in modern society, that's kind of the thing I feel, which is super hard to do, because you have so much noise. And it's really hard to differentiate between yours and the world, because the world is just so noisy.
So this reminds me a lot of... So the book I referenced earlier, Shop Class as Soulcraft, it's written by a guy named Matthew Crawford, and Matthew Crawford he has a PhD in philosophy. Went through school, got his PhD in philosophy, started working at a think tank in Washington, if I'm getting his biography correct, and before he wrote this book, got sort of fed up with the job at the think tank and decided to do what he was doing in his free time, which was repairing motorcycles. So he quit his job at the think tank and he opened a motorcycle repair business. And then some years later, he comes back and he writes this book about some of the things that he's learned. But one of the things that he points out, which I find really interesting, is that when you're doing something hands-on, let's take a carpenter who's building a house, right? You're responsible for objective standards, right? Is this wall plumb? Is this floor level? You have an objective, you have a tape measure, and that tape measure is more or less always reading the same length. Is this piece of wood 24 inches long, or is it not, right? And one of the things that he points out is that's a very different thing, sort of, I guess emotionally as a person, to hold yourself to an external standard, compared to what he was saying is when he was working at the think tank, a lot of your work is sort of managing other people's expectations of you, managing how they feel about you. You have to present a certain face because your boss has to believe this about you, and exactly. It's that social capital that we all try to gain, right? And one of the things that he said is one of the things that's really satisfying about handwork is that you're responsible to an objective standard. And if your boss says, if your boss says this isn't good enough, you can say, go check it yourself. It's 23 inches long. It's perfectly level. It's perfectly square, right? There's these objective standards, and there's less sort of like that sort of like mental management of people and of what they think of us, and so that's sort of what he goes into detail in the book about is how do you experience that differently as a human? If your life is every day living up to these standards that are sort of always shifting because they're based on what other people think of you, or is your life every day, I built a thing and you can measure it by objective, objective standards, and at the end of the day, anyone else can come up and measure it by the same objective standards, and so there's just a lot less room for interpretation there, and a lot less energy that you have to put into managing those expectations. And
it's almost like the pursuit of truth, right? It's like, hey, there's no value, because when I say value, good or bad, it's what you mean good and bad is different from what I mean good and bad. But now if you have a standard which is uniform, everybody agrees that thing has to be the ultimate truth, which comes from philosophy. And in his mind, when he does the craftsmanship, it's basically the ruler.
Right.
Right. Interesting.
Right, which is some kind of agreed upon standard, and I get this all the time from students. If I design a question or I design a prompt for an assignment that is vague, that isn't very specific, well, do you have a rubric for that? How much am I going to be graded on this part versus how much am I going to be graded on this part, right? And it's funny, but it's also, I think that's a thing inside all of us, right? We want an objective standard. Tell me what I'm going to be measured on. Tell me how I'm going to be graded on this versus this, and
we want to be tested.
Yeah, and we want to know what that is in advance so that we can meet it, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things he talks about in the book is what's the sort of psychological value of spending every day of your life meeting objective standards versus spending every day of your life meeting these sort of ever-changing standards, and what effect does that have on mental health, on those sorts of things, which I think is probably hard to measure, but it's at the very least an interesting thing to think about.
So what was his conclusion? Which was better?
Yeah, for him anyway, he supports manual work. He likes to have those objective standards. He talks about this idea that we talked about at the very beginning of agency, of having something that you feel like you can look at and see physically. I accomplished this physical thing at the end of the day, instead of I accomplished this mental task. I don't have anything to show for it. I know that I did it, but I don't have anything that I can look at and go, I did that right there.
So it's almost like a proof of your work or concept, or a projection of your internal self to the real world, so you can start to see it and have a conversation with it, or have a relationship with it.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of harder to have it when it's internal.
Right. Well, and I don't know how many times, because the work of being a professor is a lot of mental work like that, right? And I don't know how many times, and I don't know if everybody feels this way or if it's just me, but I don't know how many times, like, if I leave work at 3:30 because I'm going off to do a thing, I look around and I think about, what are other people thinking of me, because they're still working in their office and I'm going home. And it always works out in the wash, because there'll be other nights that I'm there until 6:30 and they're and they've left, but you do have that kind of like, what do people think of me? What do people think of the work that I've been doing? If you're working on a construction site building a house, if the goal for the day was to put up these 4 walls and you put up those 4 walls, you're done, right? It's very objective. And so it is interesting to think about that, and what impact that has. And are we, besides on an individual level, are we shifting on a societal level to having more? I mean, we're certainly shifting to having more jobs in the knowledge economy, right, than in the materials economy, right? Yeah. So how does that shift? Because that's really new. I mean, for the rest of human existence, the only way that you made money was to make a thing and to sell it to someone, right? And so that's really, really new. And thinking about how that impacts, how our mental health and how we think of ourselves as human beings is really interesting to me. And I guess I should have gotten my master's in cultural anthropology or something. But I do find it really interesting.
So the robots are doing the boring job for us in terms of labor, but now it turns out maybe we need at least to a certain degree of the labor to make us a well-being in general, right?
I mean, how often have, and maybe this is just me, but I think this is a common thing. You fold and put away your laundry, and you feel a really strong sense of satisfaction because it was like a concrete thing, and you did it, and you can check it off your list, right?
Compared to you have a washing machine, that's in wash everything, that thing is already folded.
Right.
All you do is just take it and put it on.
Right.
Or just put it in the case, or they can even have a robot to deliver that into your drawer.
Right.
Then, is it better life? Is it
right?
How much you want to be involved in your own survivability? Basically, is
right.
Like, do you have a robotic babysitter everywhere, or do you kind of take care of yourself?
Right. And how much, how essential is your, how much of your life deals with the essentials of your life, right?
Yeah, interesting.
And there's all kinds of people that there's a book called The Last American Man, which is about a guy named Eustace Conway, who is kind of a naturalist survivalist. He somehow came upon some money and bought himself several hundred acres of land, and he lives on them in a fairly traditional lifestyle. He has no electricity, no running water, and
is he a modern person? Like, is he alive now?
Yes, yep. He's alive. He's alive now. I think he's probably in his 60s at this point. He started this in the 1970s, 1980s, and the only way that he makes money and purchases things from the outside is he brings people onto this land and he teaches them how he does these. So he hunts most of his food, and I think there are people who are doing that kind of survival lifestyle almost as a reaction to they want to live a life that feels more essential, right? Where
it's
they're
almost like a defense of yourself. It's just like, I want to say no to whatever is going on.
Right, where your main concerns in life are food, water, shelter, right? The basic concerns are your daily concerns.
Don't need a lot to survive at all, right?
Right.
Interesting. So I would like to close with a question. You talk a lot about stuff and craftsmanship and putting your time into objects in real world. Does this kind of thing extend to the virtual world?
Interesting.
Like building a character from, or even building a house in computer, like Minecraft, for example. You spend 300 hours, build a Wisconsin landscape bluff. It's like a 1-to-1 model of lacrosse.
Right.
Does this kind of thing extend to that? Do you miss anything?
I think to a certain extent it does. I actually had this conversation when I was in grad school with a former professor of mine whose son was very into Minecraft. I think to a certain extent it does, in the sense that I think you can still take a lot of pride in building something virtual. I have a couple different friends who work in app development, right? And they are essentially, I guess the physical thing that they're building is the code, right? But it's still virtual. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And I think you can still take a lot of pride in that. I think you can still sort of measure it by some of those objective standards. I think it would be really interesting for to be someone who had, of course, programs are built so that you can't do this, but to be someone who had the skills to say, oh, you know what, this software program isn't working the way that I need it to work for me. I'm just going to go in and edit the software program, right? And that I don't know if that's a skill that somebody can have, because some of this stuff is built by a huge team of people, so maybe one person doesn't have the skill to do all of the parts of the program. But I don't necessarily think that it has to be a physical object in order to feel that same sense of pride, or that same sense of here's what I made today.
Mm-hmm. Then what's missing?
What do you mean?
What's missing doing things virtually compared to doing things with your hand?
Well, I think it's the opportunity to encounter something that sort of like materially affects us. And I don't know. I don't have a fully formed thought on this, I guess, but if you take your washing machine and you're fixing it, you're putting a certain amount of your own physical effort into it. I was at my mother's house several weekends ago, fixing a few things for her. One of the things that I did was replace a couple of faucets in her bathroom. And so I'm underneath the counter, and there's like no room under there, and you got a wrench, and it's up in a tight area, and the wrench slips, and you bang your knuckles on something, and it's like a really, if you're good at it, it's a different experience for your body physically than if you're not as good at it, and I am not as good at plumbing. And so I ended up with scrapes all over and sort of the war wounds from working on that project. And I do think that there is an interesting thing that happens when your mental exhaustion meets your physical exhaustion at the end of a project, which I think can also happen on a virtual project. But being able to the process of being able to my hands shaped or molded or changed this, right? And I used my own strength, and I also used my own intelligence to make this. I think maybe just has a bit of a different feel to it. Yeah.
Experiences. It's almost like how to say video chatting with somebody, or just take simply a hug.
Right.
Right. You get the temperature, you get the breath, you get the smile and everything. Which, like for example, if you do something in Minecraft, you cannot smell it.
Right.
Right. It's like the smell of the wood. Sometimes it's just enjoyable.
Right. Well, and I had an 8th grade math teacher that always said the best and the worst thing about calculators, and it works with computers too. The best and the worst thing about calculators is they do exactly what you tell them.
Yeah.
And computers, yeah. And there's not that moment for accidental. This happens to us all the time in theater. So like I'm doing a lighting design for theater, right? And I'm lighting the stage in a particular way, and I have a couple of lights on that I didn't mean to have on, but I sit back and I go, oh, that's really pretty. What if I just did that and then that and then that, right? And you have this moment for those sort of happy accidents, for things to be discovered. And I think that is a little different in the virtual world, in that if you want to have, there's some like really good video games that build in the opportunity to discover things, right? But ultimately, it's all responding to some kind of logic that somebody programmed, right?
This principle, the physical laws, for example, can be only so complicated in the computer world. But
right.
In real life, we don't even know what the law is.
We don't, right. We don't fully understand it. So it gives you that opportunity to discover things that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise discovered.
The excitement part.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think we had a very long and enjoyable conversation.
Well,
so
good.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. This is a great idea. I look forward to digging my way through the rest of the podcasts that you have out so far.
Great. So I just got a marketing and promoted one more user.
Very good.
Thank you.